welcome to Sunny with a Chance of Chaos, a podcast that is equal parts optimistic and realistic. Join me as we discuss the ups and downs that everyday life brings. I'm Lindsay, and I'm so glad you're here. So get a coffee, get comfy, and get ready for a little bit of life's chaos. Hi, you're back and I'm back and we're here again together on Sunny with a Chance of Chaos. Thanks so much to everyone who found the podcast, followed it, reached out to me, gave feedback and virtual hugs after the release of the first episode, especially those of you who emailed with comments and ideas. So amazing. When I hit upload on Spotify that first time, I threw up in my mouth a little bit. I am not a fan of a lot of people looking at me, which is hilarious because I'm a teacher and making 25 people look at me at the same time is literally what I get paid to do. But I seriously am the person who would want the floor to open up and for me to drop into it and disappear forever if I ever ended up on the Jumbotron at a hockey game, for example. I can't handle it. But this podcast feels really good and the creative process feels really good, and sharing stories, mine and yours, feels really, really good too. So creating community where there wasn't one before has been the greatest gift of doing this podcast. So thank you for being part of the chaos community. What we're talking about today may be a new term for some of you. The concept of comparative suffering is fairly new to me, and I'm still wrapping my head around it. If I think back, though, I had some understanding of the idea of comparative suffering back about 11 years ago without knowing what it was called. I have a dear friend named Jay. We have known each other for what seems like forever. She has been in my life for ages. We went through a phase before I had kids where we would get together on Wednesday nights and make a new recipe we had never made before. We would drink wine spritzers and play Yoshi's Island on an old Super Nintendo console. She was there for the birth of both my kiddos, and just genuinely, she's a steadfast friend. I trust her judgment and her opinion. And a conversation we had one day in a park about 11 years ago has impacted my life in a significant way. I was going through a rough patch at that time in my life. I was feeling very disconnected from the people in my life. Things at work were crazy. I was actually struggling at the time to get a teaching contract. I had a busy toddler and a busy preschooler, and I had a puppy. It was chaotic. It was a chaotic season in my life. I was feeling lonely. I was feeling sorry for myself. But there wasn't one big thing that I could say was wrong. There hadn't been a death and no one was sick, and there hadn't been a fire. I hadn't lost my job or my home. I was just struggling. So I confessed all of this to Jay as she pushed my 18-month-old in a swing, and I told her how I was just so tired, and I complained a lot. And as soon as I was done downloading all my sad spam on her, I immediately felt awful. Instead of feeling better for having gotten a lot of this stuff off my chest and into the hands and heart of a very safe person who I knew would hold the space for me, I felt worse. I felt so much worse. So I started backpedaling and I said, I know I have it really good, and I know my life is great, and so many people have it so much worse than me, and I should just be grateful and I should just stop complaining. The line, so many people have it so much worse than me, that's what really caught Jay's attention. She stopped me and said, oh, friend. Oh, friend. It doesn't always matter how hard things are for other people. How much they are suffering has no effect on how much you are suffering, and vice versa. Just because someone has it worse than you doesn't mean that what you're going through isn't hard. It's all relative. You can feel empathy for folks who are in the struggle, but you also have to feel empathy for what you're going through. It's all relative. Those were really powerful words. Essentially, she was saying, stop comparative suffering. Her perspective made me realize that we aren't doing anyone any favors by reducing our struggles in our minds because someone has it harder than us. My rejection of my own suffering wasn't going to end world hunger or bring about peace. It's all relative. My suffering was still my suffering. This very helpful bit of permission has stayed with me throughout the past 12 or so years. I know I have a very lovely life, and I also know that sometimes things get hard. So instead of looking outward when things get hard to compare my suffering with that of someone who objectively has it worse than I do, I first look inward. I feel empathy for me and whatever my suffering might be at that time. And then I do the next right thing, whatever that might be, whether it's self-care or setting a boundary, whatever that is. I'm very grateful for Jay for that bit of insight and the permission to sit with my suffering and my discomfort and my pain instead of just dismissing it. That day, 11 years ago, it was an actual problem for me that my puppy had chewed through 89% of my shoes that week and that I hadn't had a full night's sleep in 3 years. Someone else's dog may have undergone surgery because they ate a 2x4, and my shoe shortage was still problematic. This does seem like an appropriate place for me to check my privilege. There's a very important societal element here called privilege, and not everyone has been all that aware of how this affects their lens on the world. This is something I have been learning about in my own day-to-day experiences. I'm aware of the opportunities that have been afforded to me in my life, and I am aware that suffering for me looks very different than that of the more marginalized groups I live and work alongside. My awareness of this grows with every passing day, and I'm learning how to support people in marginalized communities in the best way that I can. So what is comparative suffering and why does it matter to us? Comparative suffering is when we try to make sense of our own struggle by comparing it to other people's struggles. We are essentially creating a pain hierarchy to figure out subconsciously how upset we should be about our stuff. This way of thinking makes you feel like you can't complain because someone has it worse than you. For example, someone whose thought patterns are formed in terms of comparative suffering might believe they suffer more than someone who got caught in the rain, but less than a starving child, even though they themselves are suffering in their own way. So in researching for this podcast, I actually discovered that comparative suffering can go in both directions. I had never considered that before. As a quick aside, let me tell you, if you want to learn about the world and learn about yourself and fast, start a podcast. It has been a huge learning experience for me in about a million ways, from the content to the tech to the audio. I am learning something new every day. As I was saying, as I learned, comparative suffering can be determining that your struggle is insignificant compared to others, or that it's actually far worse than others and that you're suffering way more. Both of these comparisons can do their own kind of damage to our mental health as we process the hard things in our lives. Let's use an example of a common struggle we all had recently during the COVID-19 global pandemic. In case you, by chance, were sleeping for the last 5 years because you pricked your finger on a spinning wheel or something and you missed out on the chaos of the last 4 years, let me remind you what we went through. Bear in mind, this is a white, middle-class, North American female perspective. This is what I know. March 2020, global pandemic hits, loads of people get sick, everyone gets super scared, the world shuts down, and we stay home for months on end. Wine spritzers and boxed wine was the thing. Uber Eats orders were consumed en masse. Much window art was created. Wordles were exchanged, toilet paper was hoarded, many jobs were lost, many lives were lost. I think we can define this as chaos. And I think it can be stated and agreed upon that most everyone suffered during those years in some way, shape, or form. For some, it was suffering via actual illness or losing a loved one to illness. For others, it was getting a home haircut. For some, it was unemployment. For others, it was actually a hugely increased workload. If you happen to work in IT or for Zoom, there were folks guiding their kids through online school while simultaneously working. There was homelessness and mental health decline. Families and loved ones became estranged when they discovered how wildly they differed on some of the political issues of the pandemic. So, what did all these experiences have in common? They were all suffering. I was fortunate enough not to lose my job or my home or to get too sick when I finally did fall victim to Omicron. I'm grateful for all of this, and yet I still suffered from fear, anxiety, isolation. Sharing my kids between two homes was tricky at that time. Making choices for my kids' education and their health and my health, and even going to the grocery store became traumatic in its own way. I remember standing in the frozen food section at the grocery store with a mask on, a basket in my hand, reading the energy and the fear in the shoppers around me and bursting into tears while I reached for a frozen pizza. I was extremely disoriented, as many of us were. Time had less meaning for me, and I had lost a handle on the rhythms of life as I knew it. And yet each night I would watch reports on the CBC of death tolls climbing and homelessness and poverty worsening. And I would feel so guilty for feeling sorry for myself in the frozen food section. For those of you who held on to the pillars of their lives, health, jobs, homes, the gratitude was enormous. I don't doubt it. And also, there was sometimes an accompanying guilt that came along with feeling sad about the more superficial stuff, missing out on that birthday party for your grandma that you had planned, or Christmas being moved to the garage, or the concert tickets that they had paid so much for. And then I listened to an incredible podcast. I'll tell you about it in the resource section at the end of the podcast. This particular episode opened my mind to the idea that all suffering in the pandemic was real. Everyone was suffering, and all to a different degree. I had gone for a socially distanced walk with my best friend and neighbor, and we started talking about the content of the podcast. We had both listened to it earlier that day, and we both came to realize that feeling guilty about what we had not lost was actually in and of itself creating more suffering, and it didn't actually help or assist anyone who had lost more than we did or had suffered greater loss in the grand scheme of things. It was eye-opening, to say the least, and from that day, I gave myself permission to mourn the things I had lost and consciously feel grateful for the things I could celebrate. For example, my physically distanced 40th birthday party porch drive-by thing was awesome. I know some of you listening were there. It was amazing. We were on the porch and we were 6 feet apart and I was eating shawarma fries. It was so much fun. To be honest, the other thing was the slower pace and more time with my kids. That was a gift and I was grateful for it. I grieved my own personal losses and recognized that just because someone suffered something that objectively seemed way more consequential than I had, did not mean that I myself did not suffer. And I guess it goes the other way too. This is the part that's new to me. It does an equal amount of harm when we overestimate the amount of suffering we are incurring. This has the potential to cause someone to sink to a level of self-pity that's difficult to dig themselves out from under. It also may cause folks to lose perspective and perhaps even result in creating a disconnect from other humans who are also in pain and suffering. We're likely less able to feel empathy or see their suffering when we're so blinded by our own, perhaps over-magnified view of our struggles. What do we do about it? I think the key antidote to comparative suffering is really simple. It's empathy. If we can have equal amounts of empathy for those around us who are in the weeds and also hold space for empathy for ourselves and our own struggles, This is the solution. See, everyone suffers. The solution is recognizing the suffering of others and having compassion without comparing their situations to our own at all. Author Erica Lane said, "So what if we all agreed not to evaluate, dissect, tally, and rank each other's pain right now? What if we opt out of the hardship Olympics and make a pact to lead with compassion instead?" So, beautifully worded, by the way, each day, try to lead with compassion and empathy. And then in the evening, when the house is settled and you're running over and over and over again in your mind how much it will cost to have the scratch on the side of your car repaired, or how to get your teenager to put his dishes in the dishwasher for the love of everything, you are allowed to feel empathy for yourself and hold that space for you too. Here's a quick lesson in semantics that might help you with providing empathy to someone who's struggling, or to your own beautiful self when you are struggling. I recently adopted the practice of replacing the word but with the word and in most of my speaking, writing, thinking. This is actually one of the basic tenets of something called emotional coaching. I just learned this actually recently. I didn't even know what that was. When you use the word but, it serves to negate everything you've said before it. For example, I see that you're struggling with that homework question, but you have a 90 in the class. So, or, I love your lasagna, but it's really, really salty. Replace but with and in those sentences. Go ahead. Try it right now. Do it. See the difference? The word and validates, and the word but negates. My friends often tease me for overusing the term, and also when I'm speaking, I'm sure you'll hear it once or twice in the podcast if you keep listening. You might say to yourself, "I'm so busy at work, I can't even keep up." And also, I really like the people I work with and I can lean on them to get all this stuff done. All the parts of that statement about suffering are true and remain true when we use the word and. That's just a hot linguistic tip for you. One last thought I have. Let's flip this idea on its head for a minute. Instead of comparing our suffering, let's discuss the suffering caused by comparison. They're different, I promise. Franklin Roosevelt said, "Comparison is the thief of joy." And this statement is as true as any I've ever heard. This exact experience of having my joy stolen daily is the main reason why I disengaged from many social media platforms. Each time I looked at someone else's perfect sunny vacation or beautifully plated TikTok pasta or their fresh from salon hair, I would feel terrible about my own situation, even though my own vacations, my own cooking, my hair were pretty good. Although I have to say, I did not burn one, but 2 batches of muffins just last weekend. I should have posted that on social media. What we tend to forget, though, is that people really only post the good stuff on socials, the perfect muffins. It's less often on Instagram, say, that you would see a video of a toddler throwing a tantrum at Disney or a picture of the parking ticket that one received when just running in for a boxcar donut. But that's the stuff that makes us all human. That's the stuff that makes us relatable. Welcome to the resource section. This is where we get to find out more. It's my favorite section of the podcast. It has a really lame name. So if you have better suggestions, please shoot me a message. I couldn't find a book that was specifically about comparative suffering, but I did find a couple titles that I think are quite relevant, and they actually speak more to the antidote to comparative suffering of empathy that I was talking about. They are Fierce Self-Compassion by Kristen Neff and Purposeful Empathy by Anita Nowak. The podcast I wanted to talk about, I mentioned earlier in this episode, is called Unlocking Us with Brene Brown. The episode is called Comparative Suffering, the 50-50 Myth, and Settling the Ball. This episode was released March of 2020. The YouTube video finally is with Damon Brown. It's called Comparative Suffering Hurts Emotional Intelligence. This video's about 11 minutes long. It's a really good one. And lastly, it's time for our gratitude minute. I want to thank Jay for allowing me to use her story in this week's episode and for being a beautiful and wonderful addition to my life and the lives of my kids over the years. I also want to thank my colleague T, who taught me the language of emotional coaching and is just generally a rock star human. Spring is here in Ontario, and I am grateful for longer days, warmer mornings, and little things coming back to life after a long, rainy winter. In the words of Natalie Merchant, spring keeps her promises. No cold can keep her back. What a great line. Thanks again for joining us. I can't wait to get your feedback, your messages, comments, stories, and most importantly, what you want to see discussed in other episodes. Send me a message anytime at sunnywithachanceofchaos@writeme.com. That's WRITE me.com. When chaos hits, don't forget to turn your face towards the sun. See you next time. Thanks. Bye.